This story is about our land, about the importance of our land, about food security, about the management of the land that sustains us.
We have to communicate that we're going to lose the best of what we have if we don't plan now.
We have a huge recreational pressure on the agricultural operations where I live. And most of that is Calgarians. And I think if you really sat down and talked to them, most of them would want to do the right thing. But I don't know if I want to wait 30 years to see it happen.
Everybody has a thing they want to do on a finite resource, which is the land base. And we have to start looking at the effects that we're having on that and how do we make that move forward into the future so that we're not living on a desert in another 5 generations.
We still have the chance to make a difference and to change some of our habits and our practices to make it better.
The average Albertan, the severely normal Albertan, seems to think that we can have everything everywhere all the time. And maybe that philosophy worked quite well for many decades, but maybe it's no longer the philosophy that works well in a province that's becoming progressively busier. So that's kind of a segue to our economic engine. So we have a system right now where we don't seem to be too challenged to find risk capital. Money comes into Alberta quite quickly. We blend it by bringing in people and significant immigration. We run that through a natural resource production engine, which draws down on natural capital, our air, our land, our water, and produces commodities. We have a superheated economy. It's based primarily on the production of natural resources, and the tempo of that economy is running hotter than any other jurisdiction in North America. Now, out of that has created an amazing amount of benefits, but also some challenges, some liabilities. So some recent work done by the Alberta Land Institute with the Alces Group has shown that there are some key trade-offs. We've seen a loss of quality and area of high-quality soils as we pave them over. We've seen a reduction in small surface water as we've drained those waters. We've seen a reduction in the amount of water actually in our aquifers. Water quality in many parts of the province has declined significantly. Our native grasslands are smaller and what's left are highly fragmented. And we've seen a reduction in native biodiversity, particularly in the white area. So those are some losses that Albertans can observe as we've seen some gains in other parts of the economy. Now, if we were to bring it all together, here's the province of Alberta, and we can see the Upper Bow Basin right here. We're going to look at ecological goods and services if we put carbon, water quality, and water quantity all on the table at the same time. How has it changed? We're going to start here in 1910, looking at it township by township. So there's 1910, and notice the scale goes from 1, not to 0, but to 0.75. The trend is negative. And here we're seeing changes in ecological goods and services in Alberta decade by decade as the population grew and agriculture came and forestry logged portions of our green area and the oil and gas sector unfolded. So if you were to look at all of our ecological goods and services over the first, say, 100 years of Alberta, we've seen a significant change. So why did that happen? Well, the key driver here is human population. So how have they changed through time? Here we're going to look starting in 1905 when Alberta became a province and watch as our population grew. And I'm going to stop about 1930. And you notice here we've got about 750,000 Albertans and 7 out of every 10 Albertans lived in the country. 70% rural, 30% urban. So let's let the population continue to expand to where we are today, which is about 3.7 million. And now 80% of all Albertans live in cities, only 20% live in rural. So we've seen an exponential increase. Where is that population living? Primarily in the Edmonton-Calgary corridor. 3 out of 4 Albertans live in the Edmonton-Calgary corridor. And that's going to continue to grow. So if we have, well, back in 2005 we had 3.6, now we have 3.7 million population. If it grows even at conservative estimates, it will double and we'll have at least 7.5 million by 2050. That's when basically your grandchildren are your age, 2 generations. Where are we going to put the next 3 in this case, 9 million people? Well, let's take a look at the biggest hamlet we have in Alberta, that's Calgary. And here's Calgary in 1951, sitting at 93 square kilometers. March forward to 2007, Calgary's now about 600 square kilometers, and it's consumed a lot of surrounding land. Most of that was agricultural production. If Calgary continues to grow in area at the same rate as it has for the previous 4 decades, by 2057, Calgary will be 3,000 square kilometers, and will have consumed these areas. Now, I'm not saying it's going to be precisely like that, but if it respects the same polygonal growth, that'll be the size of Calgary. So with that comes phenomenal benefits, but I would argue also comes phenomenal liabilities, and we need to discuss what those liabilities are. And obviously one of those is the paving of some of the best soils in the province of Alberta. So right now, if you were to add up all settlements in Alberta, all residential, towns, cities, and rural residential, agricultural farm yards, and the acreage people, it's 5,000 square kilometers. That will increase by 9,000 kilometers by 2055 to 14,000 square kilometers. So where will the next 9,000 square kilometers come from? Well, primarily the Edmonton-Calgary corridor, not exclusively, but primarily through the loss of croplands and native habitat. And if you look at a commodity price of $1.5 million per square kilometer, that represents about $13.5 billion. And that's going to be a challenging conversation as cities grow, and that amount of money is on the table for farmers and ranchers to sell. So there's benefits to it, but there's also some liabilities. Well, let's look at it from a different perspective. Here's Alberta. All of Alberta is underlain by soils. Even the Precambrian shield is soils, but they're exceptionally poor, obviously. These are our black loams. These are brown loams. This is where people live. This is a map showing the distribution of humans in the province of Alberta. Let's take that map and overlay it on our soils and look at where basically 95% of all Albertans live, dissolve that off the landscape, and you can see that one of the key issues we have is where people live and where they want to live and where we'll put the next 3 to 4 million people is directly over top of the better soils we have in the province of Alberta. And as we grow and expand into those soils and displace agriculture, they will be farming and ranching on lands that are progressively of lower soil quality. There's a consequence there. So we're looking at in the next 50 years of losing between 5,000 and 8,000 square kilometers on some of Alberta's better agricultural soils. We cannot undo that trend if it happens. So that leads into agriculture. So let's look at it. So here's the decade of 1910. You're seeing the arrival of agriculture in Alberta, in the tall and short grass prairies, and moving west into the foothills and further north into the parkland, and Peace River takes off. And so here's the pattern by which agriculture has grown. And it looks like it's leveled off, but there's actually a more complex story there. Agriculture continues to expand at a much faster rate than this graph shows, but the total amount of agriculture on the land base is not growing. Why? Because other things are growing into agricultural lands. And here you can see the distribution of where agriculture occurs. It's our white area. That doesn't surprise any of you. Well, what about on the livestock side? So back in 1910, this was the distribution of cattle in Alberta. Let's let it grow and get to see where the density of cattle in this province are. And of course, as you know, we've seen some adjustments in the last decade with respect to cattle. So this isn't just cow with calf at foot. This has got your steers in there too. And you get to see their distribution. Where do those forage crops come from? Okay, so now let's look at cropland loss. This is looking at the total number of hectares that have been eaten over by roads, by well sites, by acreages, by cities, by any footprint that has removed agriculture. And this year, it's 15,000 hectares of our existing cropland are going to be consumed by non-agricultural land uses. And it's been growing all the way back from 1905. And it will continue to grow. So what are some of the implications there? Here we're looking at the total amount of cropland per person. We could call this food security. How well are we feeding ourselves? Well, when we started agriculture, we were at about 4 hectares of cropland for every person in the province of Alberta. That actually grew to about 5 hectares in about the 1950s, 1960s, and ever since then it's been declining. We're now down to 2.3 hectares of cropland per person in the province of Alberta. This red bar represents 0.8 hectares per person. It is considered, for our latitude, the amount of land we require if we wanted to feed ourselves. And we're going to get there in about 2055. So you and I, we've all grown up in a province that not only met the domestic forage requirements or food requirements, actually exported a significant amount of food. Well, by 2055, we'll probably break through that barrier and we'll be a net importer of food. A net importer of food. We import food right now, but we export a lot more than we import. But in 2055, if the population continues to grow at the rate it is, and we continue to erode these agricultural land bases, we will become a net importer.
The significant changes that we're going to have to go through as society to get by that we can do anything anywhere. We're no longer, I think the term is, we're no longer the first one at the water hole anymore. And we have to start looking at the effects that we're having on that and how do we make that move forward into the future.
It just occurs to me more and more all the time that not all of us are benefited equally by this affluent society that we live in. And those of us in agriculture, I think, are really aware that the costs of affluence are not equally apportioned either. And I think that as ranchers and farmers, that we bear a higher share of the cost than most others do. And that cost is reflected directly onto the land, onto the landscape. And those of us that are stewards of it see it as no one else sees it.
Water and land quality can be have measured value. I think that's important to think about.
Taking shortcuts is going to cost us more to fix the problem than it is to prevent the problem. So I think that demands some leadership. And it's easy to say politicians should lead, but I think Albertans are probably getting closer to want to lead, and certainly the farm sector. I think we need to show leadership on this. Many of us do. When it comes to food safety, when it comes to environmental compliance, we're doing that in the ag sector. And so I think we need to be braver about that leadership.
If Alberta can't feed itself in 70 years, who in the heck can? I mean, who produces more food with a smaller population than Alberta does? So it's kind of scary in some respects. We saw some food riots a few years ago when the price of food went up. So, you know, whatever it is we do, we're going to have to figure this thing out, or try to. We're going to have to be moving in the right direction at least.
Historically, there's been an imbalance. There's been too much emphasis placed on rewarding people only for commodity production and not enough attention at another very important bank account, which is our ecological goods and services. Albertans want their government and their land users to balance that equation. So that requires us to put all of these services and commodities on the table and have a balanced conversation. So food, settlements, fuel, fiber, water quality, water quantity, biodiversity, all discussed. That requires a new conversation. And that conversation, I think we could argue, is not about letting everyone do everything everywhere all the time, needing to make tough decisions, and I think is going to require conversations about trade-offs, about limits, about thresholds, about risks, about knowledge. So what the natural capital conversation is about saying, yes, we want jobs, royalties, and rents, but doing it in a way that doesn't, through time, erode our bank accounts to deal with water and carbon and biodiversity. Yes, GDP is a very important metric of economic performance. It's driven by commodity production. Commodity production can't happen unless we actually drain some of our bank accounts, or at least ask of them. And in turn, of course, that influences how much is left. So that has fueled the conversation about ecological goods and services. I think it can be said that the food producers and other land users at Alberta in the future are going to be asked to perform on true economic performance, which is basically dollars through time, which is not just GDP, it's also ecological goods and services. Begging the question, does the current suite of policies in the province of Alberta actually encourage us in that direction? I think that's what our grandkids want. This is not an anti-business conversation. This is a pro-business conversation. We're putting all indicators on the table.
The Upper Little Bow is probably one of the special areas in Alberta. It's everything from Banff, the whole Bow water system, all the way to Calgary. So a big chunk of Alberta's people, some of our forestry, some of our iconic landscapes, as well as the water towers and the water filtration system. So when you've got something that special, there's always challenges, there's always opportunities.
Well, let's look at this particular question at a smaller chunk of land. But the story we're going to tell, I think, could be told anywhere else in Alberta. The idea being that this represents a bank account. We need to start thinking of it that way. So the specific ecological goods and services we're going to talk about are water quality, water quantity or supply. We're going to talk about biotic carbon, the amount of carbon in the soils and in vegetation, tourism and recreation, food balance, and what happens when you add all this together. Okay, so we're going to start to zoom in a little bit here and realizing that the texture of these landscapes, how we conduct our forestry, how we conduct our agriculture, how we conduct our settlement patterns influences the landscape and the flow of goods and services off of it. So we're going to give you some numbers. We've actually computed what these values were once you go back 200 years. We can show you where they are today. And if these land uses continue to unfold the way they're expected to, based on current government policy, where they'll be in 2 generations, in 70 years. We grew these land uses into the future in 2 different ways. One, we called it business as usual, which means how we're doing things today will just propagate those practices into the future. How we graze our cattle, how we cultivate our crops, how we grow our cities, how we cut our forests, how we build our roads. And then we contrasted that with best management practices. What do we mean by best management practices? I won't go into the details, but I'll summarize it. People, for the most part, are going to live in settlements. So best management practices means rather than growing out, we're going to try and grow up more than we are right now. There's going to be nodal development, and if we're going to have rural residential, we're going to try and minimize the amount of sprawl of that. We're going to try and put people into nodes. Where settlements do expand, they will not expand into riparian habitat, and they won't expand into wetlands. With respect to forestry, we're still going to harvest the trees, but we're going to increase the amount of riparian buffer strip. That will require a reduction in annual allowable cut. We're going to leave more residual green trees on the cut blocks. With respect to agriculture, there will be no further expansion of agriculture into either native rangelands or wetlands in this best management practice approach, and greater precision application of nitrogen and phosphorus on the landscape, meaning less of it runs off into surface water, and try to do a better job of, as we graze our cattle, of keeping them away from riparian areas. So this represented the suite of best management practices. Okay, so if we're going to talk about ecological goods and services, in a monetary sense, we're going to have to put dollars on it. We're trading carbon here at about $74 a metric ton. Water quality basically requires us, as society, $55 a kilogram to remove nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment. So as we put more of it into the water, there's a cost to take it out. Water supply, we're basically trading at $1.38 a cubic meter. Tourism and recreation is recognized to contribute $621 per hectare of maximum tourism landscape per year. Food balance is basically driven on kilocalories, in other words, the demand out there and the supply. And the total ecological goods and services, therefore, are carbon, water quality, water supply, and tourism. And this particular graphic doesn't include food security, and I'll explain why later. So let's start with water quality. This first map shows you the Upper Bow Basin, and there's Calgary, where Calgary would be in range of natural variability. This is the model showing what would have happened if we were all sitting here 200 years ago and there weren't any other people and there weren't any other land use. And you can see water quality, red is bad and green is good. Water quality isn't really that great high in the mountains, and that's because of the amount of sediment that it runs off. Water quality is green where we have our riparian buffer strips, because it's very good at filtering out nitrogen and phosphorus, which there is without any land uses. So you can see the gradient from really good, and Mother Nature gives us some landscape that doesn't necessarily contribute to really good water quality. Let's grow it to 2012. This map looks different than this map. The major difference here is the intensive areas of settlement and some of our cultivation practices, which are generating nitrogen and phosphorus, and acreages, and their effects through human waste. So what we have today is not what we had. Let's grow it another 2 generations into the future with business as usual. If we've degraded water quality to a degree, it will continue to erode, it will continue to be reduced. Let's grow it another 70 years into the future, and the only difference, we're not going to change the amount of wood production or cattle or crop production, we're just going to change our practices, is this. So we're seeing that there will be a degradation, but a significant difference between business as usual and best management practices. Now let's chart it. This is what we had. This is where we are right now. We're going 70 years into the future. We've already seen a $10 million a year reduction in water quality in the Upper Bow Basin. This isn't Alberta, this is just the Upper Bow. 7 decades into the future, if we wanted to take all that water and bring it back to the quality we had with range and natural variability, it would cost us $75 million a year. If we adopted best management practices, rather than being a $75 million reduction, it would be $21 million, showing you in very clearly the importance of best management practices in terms of mitigating risk. So water quality has already been reduced. It'll be reduced a lot more, and best management practices can make not all, but some of this go away. Now let's look at water supply. So we're going to move from quality to quantity. So here's our map, and by water quantity, we're talking about aquifers. So in the model, what we've done is basically equilibrated the water in the aquifers based on runoff, driven by precipitation, and it's our reference point. If we look at where it is today, we can see that the amount there's been, with yellow being a reduced value compared to green, there's less water in our aquifers today. Why? 2 major reasons. Our settlement patterns require water to run off quickly and don't allow as much water to infiltrate and get into our aquifers. And secondly, agricultural crops encourage faster runoff than you'd have with native rangelands. That's why we're here today. If we go 7 decades into the future, we're seeing a much greater reduction in the essentially water quantity of our aquifers, because every year we've got more straws in the milkshake as we're sucking on those for rural residential and cities and all those other land uses that need water. And our land uses are contributing to faster runoff, getting into our mainstem rivers, and not doing as good a job of replenishing our aquifers. So this is business as usual, and this is best management practices. And they're not identical. There's a significant difference between those two. So let's actually plot those. Here's where we were, here's where we are, $140 million difference over 7 decades, and we can drop that 140 down to about $125 million, looking at water trading at $1.38. So, under all circumstances, we're going to see a drop in the amount of water in our aquifers. How much that drops depends on best management practices, and whether we grow out or grow up, how we conduct our cultivation practices, where we graze our cattle, how we allow rural residential people to live on the landscape, how we cut our wood fiber, excuse me. Now, all of you know that climate change is an issue driven by carbon. So let's talk about biotic carbon, primarily soil carbon. Some of it's in vegetation, but most of it's in our soil. Okay, so here's our distribution. It shouldn't surprise you that in the tops of mountains there's not a lot of soil, and therefore not a lot of carbon. And as we move to the eastern part of the Upper Bow Basin, we see more carbon, and again, it's these riparian buffer strips that have the greatest amount. So, have we changed carbon in the last 100, 150 years? Yes, we have. Not so much in the western part, but here we have changed by our residential patterns, not just cities, but also acreage owners and how we're conducting agriculture. Will it change in the future? Yes, it will. And this particular pattern of carbon loss is primarily tied to putting an awful lot more people in the Upper Bow Basin and cities growing out and acreages expanding. However, if we encourage Calgary to grow up, not out, and move to nodal development, we can significantly improve the amount of carbon, and particularly if we treat our riparian buffer strips differently and we conduct our agricultural practices in a progressive way. So, it's $75 a metric ton, 70 years, the net deficit is about $200 million. That can be reduced to about 110 through the adoption of best management practices. To get from here to here means you have to adopt best management practices. There's costs associated with doing that. How are we going to get paid to do that? Many people look at the area west of Calgary as being critically important to recreation and tourism. Well, if you actually survey them, there's a variety of techniques you can use. the value of every hectare of maximum tourism potential is over $600 per hectare per year. So here is the tourism potential based on willingness to pay, and apparently the mountains and the foothills are more attractive and more valuable from a tourism perspective than the grasslands. I can believe that. Maybe that wouldn't be my own preference, but I can believe people saying that. And here are the changes. Obviously, from a standpoint of ecological tourism, Calgary's not the place I'd like to be, and same with average people. And here are the changes we expect in the next 7 decades with business as usual. And if we go to best management practices, we can reduce the amount we lose in terms of recreation and tourism potential. How much? Relative to where we were back today, $140 million per year. And we can reduce that loss to $50 million a year. Again, how do we make those changes? The way in which we live, growing up versus out, allowing native grasslands to persist, maintaining good riparian habitats. Food balance. This one is probably very important to you guys. All of them are. Range of natural variability basically said the number of people on the landscape was equal to the production of that landscape. So this would be First Nations people. They didn't require the importation of a lot of food, and their demand and supply was basically in balance. Let's go to where we are today. So green is basically net. Everywhere it's green, those landscapes are producing as much food as they demand. There's this big red blob. That's Calgary, and you can see the surrounding communities. This is where there's a lot of demand, but the capacity of those individual quarter sections to produce is very, very low. So it's not surprising. Calgary needs a lot of food, so do the surrounding communities. They're reliant on the communities around them. And you can see these dark green areas are producing a lot of food relative to their demand. This area is producing essentially no food and has a tremendous demand. So this is where a lot of you live. Now, where will we be in 7 decades? There'll be an awful lot more of this landscape that needs a lot of food and a whole lot less that has the capacity to produce it. So here we're moving to a less and less food secure landscape. However, with the adoption of best management practices, we can mitigate a fair bit of this risk. It will not be as good in 7 decades as it is today, but it'll be a whole lot better than business as usual. We are clearly eroding year by year our capacity to produce food on this Upper Bow landscape. Yet the number of people, the number of mouths that need to be fed is increasing. So what happens when we add all of this together? It's looking at total ecological goods and services. This is where we were. Green has very high services. Yellow, still very high. Nothing in the red. The bank account was full. Here's where we are today. We have places where we have significantly mined our ecological goods and services in terms of water quality, water quantity, carbon. It's going to get a lot worse. Or we can still allow those populations to grow, and we can manage that much more effectively, such that relative to where we are today, if we don't change our practices and continue to push with business as usual, there'll be about a $500 million liability in the bank account. We can reduce that to about $300 million, meaning that there's about a $250 million benefit to adoption of best management practices over 7 decades. Okay, so let's think about that. Statement. During the next 2 generations, or 70 years, the Upper Bow Basin will incur a loss of about $550 million of ecological goods and services. It equates to a draining of the bank account by about $8 million per year. Almost half of that, 45% of that loss, can be avoided through best management practices. Okay, this equates to a break-even value to society of about $3.6 million per year. So if we adopt best management practices just in the Upper Bow alone, it should be worth to Calgary about $3.6 million per year. So the question really is, I think, is can we initiate a conversation in Alberta about how to fiscally reward land users? By that I mean residential, people involved in growing crops and livestock and cutting trees and recreation, to adopt best management practices that provide long-term and sustainable benefits to Albertans. So the problem here, and I see a lot of these people in the room, is that they need to make a living.
My family and I ranch in the high foothills northwest of Cochrane in the Ghost River area.
My husband and I ranch southeast of Pincher Creek, not too far from the Waterton River, and we raise cattle on that ranch, and I also work part-time for the Nature Conservancy of Canada.
I ranch a cow-calf operation southwest of Cochrane in the Jumping Pound watershed of the Bow Basin.
I have a small cow-calf operation on the western edge of Cardston County on the Waterton River, down in southern Alberta.
I work at the family farm near Picture Butte, and we do grain farming.
We farm in the Picture Butte Enchant area, irrigation, dryland, a little bit of cattle.
West of Nanton, south of Calgary, and primarily grain farm, but cow-calf and feedlot as well.
Cow-calf operation and a feedlot operation at Nanton.
We farm east of Carstairs. We do grain, pulses, and oil seeds, and we also have a purebred herd of Limousin cattle.
What society's saying is that these people need to make money, but we're expecting more of them. We expect them to grow crops and to give us good water quality and quantity and carbon in our soils. Okay, and we've just shown that we can do a better job in all of these. It's not about certain people being wrong and others being right. Well, we've shown clearly that the adoption of best management practices can significantly improve the performance of all of these. But sometimes there's cost to doing that. So how do we actually reward, through the development of alternative economic instruments, a means for people like myself who live in a city to pay landowners, land users, for producing a broader suite of services? That's going to be a very challenging conversation. There's going to have to be many incentives, and they're going to operate at different scales. We just told a story that looks like somehow people in Calgary should be putting at least $3 or $4 or $5 million on the table for landowners upstream of Calgary every year. Well, Calgary is a very small landscape compared to Alberta. Here's where it sits. So you can imagine if we did this particular exercise for the entire province, how quickly we're draining its bank account, and how quickly we need to have a conversation about developing new policies. So how do Albertans view Alberta? How do they view the Upper Bow? Or end right where we started. Yeah, they want it all. They want the vistas, they want the cities, they want horses, they want cattle, they want that lifestyle, they want the charismatic megafauna still to do well. We want to produce oil and gas, and even in greater quantities. We want to log our forests. We want crop production. They're all supposed to grow, by the way. The economy's supposed to grow at 2.5%. Everyone's supposed to have a job, right? Water's supposed to be great. Carbon's supposed to be great. There's supposed to be money to go around. We're supposed to lead the national economy. Some people, maybe myself, just want it for myself right now, and other people want it for their grandkids. And what I think they're telling the province, and what the province is pushing back, is somehow there's a smart way where everyone can have everything everywhere all the time. And in fact, you can't.
The first few years when you're in debt up to your ears and over your head and you're just trying to make a living, you're not really thinking about what is happening or what your influence on the land is. And as you get a little bit further on and are lucky enough to survive and kind of make a living there, you realize that the land is what sustains us.
We as landowners, we do create a benefit for the public. I believe it's getting better all the time. But somehow or another, farmers have to stay in business. To me, that's where it has to be led from, is figuring out how to get paid for the goods that we're producing other than food.
If the cities can be better at some things and we can be better at some things, I think the message in general is a common one, not just directed in one direction or the other.
The conversation is a large conversation. How do we accomplish our needs to be fed and housed on this landscape, but yet maintain the things that we have of value?
Our dreams for the future and future generations can come true if we look after our land today.